3 weeks ago, I thought a job as a fire lookout in a remote tower in the Selway wilderness would be my only escape for peace. No people, no noise, just nature. But I discovered the reason why this tower had been abandoned, a reason written in an old, weathered notebook. The moment I read the first rule, I realized I wasn't a fire lookout. I was bait for something waiting in the woods. Today, I am never going back there, and I'm going to tell you why. Before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments, which city or country are you watching this story from? Now, let the story begin. My name is Ethan. 3 weeks ago, I abandoned everything. The suffocating cubicle in Seattle, the relentless noise of the city, and a life that felt like a slow death. I traded it all for a steel cage suspended 80 feet above the ground in the heart of the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness in Idaho. I wanted silence. I wanted isolation. I thought I was escaping the world, but I quickly learned that silence in the Selway isn't empty. It's hungry. There was no handover. The previous watchman was gone, leaving behind only a battered leather journal on a dusty table. The first page contained no welcome, no instructions on forest fire reporting, only a single, frantic sentence. Silence here is not a void. It is surveillance. Obey the 10 rules or you will become nothing more than a ghost on these walls. I laughed. I assumed it was a cruel hazing ritual, the dark humor of a man broken by too much solitude. But that laughter died the moment the sun dipped below the jagged horizon on my first night. The first rule was simple. Never turn off the tower lights after midnight. The darkness here has weight. At 12:05 a.m., the generator sputtered and choked. The lights died, plunging the tower into an absolute suffocating void. Before I could even reach for my flashlight, the air pressure dropped. Outside the glass, the darkness didn't look like night. It looked like 1,000 pinprick holes in the fabric of reality, all staring at me. Then came the sound. Not a knock, but a wet, rhythmic smearing against the glass. I froze, my breath hitching in my throat as long, impossibly spindly fingers began to trace the edges of the window. They weren't human. They were searching for a gap, a pore, a way to taste the warmth inside. A chorus of voices, hundreds of them overlapping in a dissonant, chilling harmony, began to whisper from the trees below. Ethan. Let us into the warmth, Ethan. We are starving. I didn't move until the first gray light of dawn touched the pines. When it did, the voices vanished. But when I looked at the reinforced glass, I saw them. Deep, cauterized gouges etched into the material, as if the very surface had melted under the heat of their touch. By the second night, the isolation began to rot my resolve. The second rule was carved into the wall. If you hear knocking on the steel walls, never look down. I was huddled in the center of the room when the sound started. Thump, thump, thump. But it wasn't coming from the outside. It was coming from beneath the floorboards, vibrating through the steel structure itself. I squeezed my eyes shut, but then the voice returned. It was my mother's voice, clear as day, rising from the floor beneath my feet. Ethan, open the hatch. It's freezing down here. I knew it wasn't her. The forest was mimicking my memories, using my own grief as bait. I screamed at the floor, demanding it stop, but the voice twisted, turning into a guttural, inhuman shriek that vibrated through my very bones. That was when I realized the truth. This wasn't a fire lookout. It was a prison, and I was the final lock. I am currently on my 4th night. The forest is changing. The trees seem to inch closer with every hour, and the fog rarely lifts. The third rule warns, do not eat red meat. The scent of blood draws the crawlers. I have lived on cold rations for days, yet the crawlers are already there, long, spider-like silhouettes that move between the pines with a sickening, liquid grace waiting for me to lose my nerve. But tonight is worse. My radio, which has been dead since the moment I arrived, has started broadcasting static that resolved into a haunting, distorted 1950s jazz melody. The 4th rule is clear. If the radio plays music, turn it off immediately. It is not a broadcast. It is a lure. The dial is spinning on its own. The music is filling the tower, and I can hear the steel frame groaning as if something massive is leaning against the stilts, testing the tower's weight. I am sitting in the dark, watching the radio, wondering if I have the strength to reach out and silence it, or if that is exactly what it wants me to do. I don't know if the dawn will come tomorrow. I don't know if I'm even still the same person who arrived here 3 weeks ago. I only know that in the Selway Bitterroot, the night has a memory, and it has decided that I am its next meal. The radio's melody grew louder, a scratchy, warped tune that sounded as if it were being played by a pianist with too many fingers. My hand hovered inches from the power dial, but my muscles had turned to lead. The steel stilts of the tower let out a long, agonizing moan of metal under stress, a sound like a ship being crushed by ice. Something was pulling itself up. Not climbing and shifting. It felt as if the entire tower was being tilted by a massive, unseen weight. I lunged for the radio, my fingers brushing the cold plastic, and slammed the power switch to off. The silence that followed was worse than the music. It was absolute. It was heavy. For a heartbeat, the tower stopped vibrating and the wind outside seemed to vanish entirely. Then a voice, not mimicking my mother this time, but a deep, rhythmic vibration that felt like it was coming from inside my own skull, spoke a single word. Almost. I didn't sleep. I spent the remaining hours of the night curled in the center of the observation deck, a hunting knife in one hand and the journal in the other. I began flipping through the pages I had previously ignored, looking for any clue about the fifth rule. The handwriting in the journal shifted halfway through. It became tighter, more erratic, written in what looked like dark, dried sap instead of ink. Rule 5. If you see the fog turn the color of bruised plums, do not look at the horizon. Close the shutters and recite the counts. Just before dawn, the temperature plummeted. My breath began to mist in the air and the glass windows fogged over from the outside. But it wasn't white fog. It was a swirling, sickly violet like an infection spreading across the forest floor. It rose rapidly, swallowing the trees, swallowing the base of the tower, until I was floating in a purple abyss. Against every instinct I had, I forced myself to walk to the window. I felt an irresistible, hypnotic pull to look out at the horizon, to see what was moving within that bruised haze. My hand reached for the latch, my fingers twitching. The violet fog pulsed, and for a split second the veil thinned. I saw them. Hundreds of figures, tall and thin, standing perfectly still among the pines, all facing toward the tower. They weren't moving, but they were watching. I screamed, slammed the heavy steel shutters shut, and dropped to the floor, reciting the numbers written in the margins of the journal. 14269. My voice broke, but I kept going. 14269. The tower groaned as if something was pacing around the perimeter, just outside the range of my sight. The shutters rattled with a violent rhythmic force as if being struck by hail. I kept counting, my sanity fraying with every syllable. After what felt like an eternity, the violet hue outside the cracks in the shutters faded back to the dull gray of a standard mountain dawn. I waited an hour before daring to open a single shutter. The forest was back to its normal dark green state, but my supplies were gone. The ration packs I had left on the floor were shredded into fine silver dust, and the water jugs were bone dry. Something had fed on the contents of this room while I was busy counting. I sat there starving and terrified, staring at the sixth rule in the journal. If the forest floor looks perfectly flat in the morning, do not step outside for any reason. The ground is hungry. I looked through my binoculars. The jagged, uneven terrain of the Selway Bitterroot was gone. The ground around the base of the tower was as smooth, level, and dark as a freshly paved road. It wasn't earth. It was a mouth, and it was waiting for me to make the mistake of leaving. I realized then that I wasn't just a guard. I was being hunted by a system that was smarter, older, and far more patient than I could ever be. I wasn't going to get out of this alive, but if I was going to die, I was going to make sure that whatever was outside learned that a man with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous thing in these woods. I grabbed the heavy iron bolt on the door and slammed it shut, sliding the locking mechanism into place until it echoed like a gunshot in the confined space. I wasn't just a guard anymore. I was a prisoner in a cage made of steel and lies. My stomach cramped, the result of 2 days without a real meal, but I ignored the hunger. The smooth, flat earth below was still visible through the binoculars, a taunting, polished surface that didn't belong in the wild, mountainous terrain of Idaho. It was a trap, waiting for me to step down and be swallowed. I turned back to the journal, my fingers shaking as I flipped to the middle pages. The ink here was different, almost illegible, as if the writer had been trembling with the same terror I felt now. I scanned for the 6th and 7th rules. Rule 6. If the ground appears flat, do not step outside. It is a digestive trap. Do not drop anything, not even a crumb of food, or it will rise to reach for you. I looked down at my feet. The floorboards of the tower seemed thin, fragile. If the ground below was a mouth, was the tower merely the bait on a hook? I skipped to Rule 7. If you hear the sound of a bell ringing deep in the forest, turn on all your emergency flares. Do not let the light touch your own eyes. I laughed, a dry, cracking sound. Emergency flares. I had 2 boxes of them tucked under the radio. I hadn't touched them since I arrived. I grabbed them, my mind racing. Why would a bell ring in the middle of a wilderness? It didn't make sense, but in this place, sense was a luxury I had surrendered weeks ago. As I sat there, the air inside the tower began to change. It grew thick, smelling of ozone and wet earth. A faint metallic chiming sound drifted up from the trees. Ding, ding, ding. It was rhythmic, heavy, like the tolling of a cathedral bell buried miles underground. I scrambled to the flare box and ripped it open. The smell of sulfur filled the room. I didn't hesitate. I struck the first flare, the brilliant, blinding crimson light erupting instantly, casting long, frantic shadows against the walls. Then the second, the third. Within seconds, the observation deck was bathed in a savage, pulsing red glow. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing my palms against my lids until stars exploded in my vision. I remembered the rule. Do not let the light touch your own eyes. Outside, the forest erupted in a symphony of chaos. The chiming bell stopped, replaced by a sound I could only describe as 1,000 people screaming at once, muffled by layers of dirt. The tower rocked violently, the steel beams screaming in protest. Something was trying to pull the tower down, not by climbing it, but by ripping the earth from beneath its legs. I clung to the center pole of the tower, feeling the metal vibrate. I stayed there for hours, listening to the ground tearing apart, to the screeches of things that should not exist. My eyes were burning, even behind my eyelids, as the intense red light of the flares bled through. I was terrified that if I opened them, I would see things standing right in front of me, waiting for me to acknowledge their presence. When the screaming finally died down, the silence that followed was suffocating. I waited until my hands stopped shaking before I dared to lower them. The red light had faded. The flares had burned out, leaving piles of ash on the floor. I looked out the window. The smooth, flat ground was gone. The mountain slope was broken, gouged and scattered with massive boulders and uprooted pines. It looked like a battlefield. But there, standing at the base of the tower, was a single silver object, an old rusted bell, sitting perfectly upright on a patch of grass. I didn't need the binoculars to see what was carved into its side. My own name, Ethan. I looked back at the journal. Rule 8 was waiting. If an object with your name appears, do not touch it. Bury it before the sun sets, or it will bury you. I stared at the bell. The sun was already starting to touch the peaks of the mountains. I had maybe an hour of light left. I looked at the door, then back at the bell. The ground was no longer a trap, but the forest was no longer a place of trees. It was a hunting ground, and it had finally introduced itself to me by name. I grabbed the shovel from the equipment corner, opened the door, and took the first step onto the mountain that I knew, with every fiber of my being, was no longer mine. I grabbed the shovel, my arms trembling so violently that the metal head clattered against the iron doorframe like a frantic heartbeat. I didn't care about the noise anymore. The forest knew my name, and the game had shifted into a far more lethal stage. I descended the metal stairs step by step, every fiber of my being screaming at me to lock the door and never look back. When I reached the base of the tower, the air was thick with a nauseating blend of sulfur and wet, decaying earth. The silver bell glinted in the dying sunlight, a cold alien object that had no business being here. I approached it, my pulse thundering in my ears louder than the wind whipping through the pines. I remembered the 8th rule. If an object with your name appears, do not touch it. Bury it before the sun sets, or it will bury you. I didn't dare touch it with my bare hands. I used the shovel to roll it into a deep, jagged hole I dug with frantic, desperate energy. As I shoveled the dirt over it, a faint, muffled sound rose from beneath the soil. A sound like a child's stifled laughter, but with a cold, metallic resonance that made my teeth ache. I froze, but I forced myself to finish, stomping down the earth until not a trace of the bell remained. I scrambled back up the stairs, but the tower felt different, heavier, as if something had latched onto the underside of the structure and was weighing it down. I slammed the door and locked it tight. As I leaned against it, gasping for air, my eyes fell on the shovel. My blood turned to ice. Black, inky fingerprints were burned into the wooden handle, as if the bell had tried to reach out and pull me into the grave with it. I tossed the shovel into the corner and snatched up the journal, desperate for the 9th rule. The handwriting had devolved into a frantic, jagged scrawl. Rule 9. When the fog forms human shapes that circle the tower, do not close the shutters. Sit in the center and close your eyes. If you block their view, you are inviting them inside. As I read the words, the forest transformed into a sea of thick, blinding white mist. It rose, swirling and thickening until it engulfed the tower, weaving itself into shapes. Humanoid specters, tall, distorted, and shivering, began to assemble around the stilts. They had no faces, no features, yet I could feel their collective gaze piercing through the glass. I remembered the warning. I didn't reach for the shutters. I sat dead center on the floor, exposed, eyes shut tight, breathing in the smell of ozone. The room plummeted to freezing temperatures, and I heard the sickening rasp of fingernails raking against the glass from every side. They were there, dozens of them, faceless things waiting for me to break. I focused on my breathing, counting the seconds, trying to ignore the sensation of something standing directly behind me, breathing a cold, damp breath against my neck. Hours bled into eternity. The tower groaned, and a voice, hollow and familiar, whispered directly into my ear. Ethan, the 10th rule isn't in the journal. The 10th rule is that you belong to the woods now. I snapped my eyes open, gasping, but the room was empty. There was no one there. But as I glanced at the mirror bolted to the wall, I saw a message written in condensation from the inside. Not from me. Rule 10. Do not sleep before dawn. The forest only claims the souls of those who dream. I checked my watch. It was past 3 a.m. I had 2 hours left before the sun would touch the earth, but an unnatural, heavy drowsiness was crushing my eyelids. I bit my hand until blood beaded on my skin, fighting the pull, but the shadows in the corners of the room began to detach themselves, creeping closer, whispering that sleep was the only way to end the pain, that the forest wouldn't hurt me if I just closed my eyes and let go. The darkness in the room pulsed like a dying heart. I was no longer fighting for my job. I was fighting for the sovereignty of my own consciousness. The shadows creeping toward me were not merely darkness, they were extensions of the woods, reaching out to peel my spirit away from my physical body. Every time my eyelids drooped, I felt a cold, jagged sensation, as if hooks were being embedded into my subconscious, trying to drag me into the dreamscape where the forest could finally claim me. Rule 10. Do not sleep before dawn. I stood up, my legs buckling, and grabbed the only thing that felt real. The heavy, cold metal of the radio. I didn't turn it on, I used its weight. I began to pace the narrow perimeter of the observation deck, chanting the numbers I'd found in the margins of the journal over and over again. 1, 42, 6, 9. The sound of my own voice was the only anchor I had left. Outside, the faceless figures in the fog had stopped clawing at the glass. They were waiting. They knew that the longer I stayed awake, the more the forest had to work to break me. Suddenly, the floor beneath me shuddered. A sound ripped through the air, a sound so ancient and primal that it felt like a mountain splitting in half. It was a roar, but not from a throat. It sounded like the grinding of tectonic plates. Through the gaps in the floorboards, I saw a light that shouldn't have been there. It wasn't the red of the flares or the violet of the fog. It was a blinding, pulsating gold, glowing from deep beneath the earth. The tower was rising. I looked out the window and my breath caught in my throat. The tower wasn't just sitting on the ground anymore. It was being lifted. Huge, gnarled roots, thick as redwood trunks, had erupted from the soil and were wrapping themselves around the steel stilts, hauling the entire structure into the air. I was being hoisted toward the canopy, closer to the stars, closer to those eyes I had been warned about on my first night. I scrambled for the support pole, wrapping my arms around it as the tower tilted violently. I looked down, and for the first time I saw what was moving the roots. Below, in the crater left by the rising tower, was the stone giant. It was even more massive than I had imagined, a cathedral of living rock and moss, its movements as slow as the shifting of continents. It wasn't attacking. It was clearing the land, and it was looking directly at me. I realized then that the tower had never been a prison for me. It was a vessel, and the forest was preparing to migrate. Ethan. The wind howled through the open gaps where the metal had torn. The dawn is coming, but there is no sky left for you. I clung to the pole as the giant continued to rise, carrying the tower higher into the thickening mist. The rules in the journal, the trees, the lights, the giant, they were all part of a single colossal organism, and I was the parasite that had finally been noticed. The sun began to bleed over the horizon, but there was no warmth in its light. It was a cold, pale gray, illuminating a world that had fundamentally shifted. I reached the top of the canopy, the tower swaying in the high-altitude winds. I looked into the journal one last time, but the pages were blank. All the rules, all the warnings had faded away, replaced by a single terrifying truth written in my own handwriting. The forest has reached its destination. It is time to step outside. I looked at the door. The handle was turning, and for the first time in my life I wasn't afraid of what was outside. I was afraid because I realized that the thing knocking at the door sounded exactly like me. The handle turned with a slow, deliberate click. My heart wasn't racing anymore. It had slowed to a steady rhythmic thud that echoed the grinding of the roots beneath the tower. I stood in the center of the observation deck, my hand gripped tightly around the heavy radio, but I didn't point it at the door. I stared at the door. The wood groaned as it swung inward, not with a burst of violence, but with a fluid, liquid grace. Standing in the doorway was not a monster. It was me. He or it looked exactly as I did when I had arrived in the cellway 3 weeks ago. My hiking boots were clean, my jacket was uncreased, and there was a look of naive, desperate hope in his eyes. The look of a man who thought he had finally found peace. He didn't look like a horror. He looked like a memory of a version of myself I had already discarded. "You're late," he said. His voice was mine, but it lacked the hollow, ringing vibration of the forest. It sounded flat, like a recording played on a loop. "What are you?" I whispered, my voice raspy from days of silence. The thing that looked like me stepped into the tower, the floorboards not even creaking under his weight. "I am the reason you don't remember the drive here," he replied with a sad, thin smile. "You didn't find this job, Ethan. You didn't answer an ad. You walked into these woods because you were already dead. You just didn't want to accept the silence." My mind fractured. I tried to reach for the memory of my life in Seattle, the cubicle, the noise, the traffic, but it wasn't there. It was just white static, a blank, painless void. "If I'm dead," I said, my knuckles white on the radio, "and then what is this?" "This is the transition," the other Ethan said, gesturing to the windows. Beyond the glass, the canopy had vanished. The tower was no longer swaying in the wind. It was suspended in a vast golden nebula. The stone giant was there, not moving anymore, its massive face pressed against the glass, eyes like dying suns looking in at us. The trees were not trees. They were shimmering, ethereal circuits of light connecting the earth to the void. "The rules weren't meant to keep you safe from the forest," he said, stepping closer. "They were meant to keep the forest safe from you. You were a chaotic element, Ethan. A human soul that couldn't stop questioning, couldn't stop fearing, couldn't stop existing in a place that demands non-existence." He held out his hand. It looked like mine, but the skin was translucent, showing the faint golden pulse of the forest beneath. "The tower is rising because the cycle is finished. You've survived the rules. You've paid the price. Now you have to choose. Choose what? You can step outside, let go of the name Ethan, and become a root, a branch, a whisper in the wind, a part of the foundation. Or you can stay in this cage, keep following rules that no longer matter, and wait for the tower to rot." I looked at the radio in my hand. I looked at the door where the golden light of the nebula flooded in, warm and inviting. For the first time, the hunger, the gnawing, painful, physical hunger, vanished. I set the radio down. It clattered to the floor, forgotten. I looked at the thing that was me, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly, terrifyingly light. The fear, the trauma, the weeks of psychological torture, they weren't mine to carry anymore. They were just data. They were just stories. I walked to the door. I didn't look back at the journal or the empty ration packs or the chair where I had spent nights shivering in the dark. I stepped over the threshold. The transition wasn't a death. It was an expansion. I felt my lungs fill not with air but with light. I felt my skin stretch until it was as vast as the mountain range itself. I heard the trees, the wind, the stars, and the stone giant all speaking at once, not in languages but in pure, raw meaning. I turned back to look at the tower one last time. It was shrinking, becoming nothing more than a splinter in a vast, infinite forest. And then the splinter disappeared. The Selway Bitterroot was gone. The tower was gone. Ethan was gone. And in the silence that followed, I realized the final, cruel truth. The forest hadn't reached its destination. It had only just begun to wake up. I am no longer Ethan. I am no longer a man. I am the hum in the vibrating air and the stillness of the mountain at midnight. When I stepped across the threshold, the me that had shivered in the tower didn't die. He dissolved. His memories, the cubicle, the noise of Seattle, the terror of the rules, were absorbed into the soil like rainwater. I can feel them now drifting through the roots of the trees like ancient dusty dreams. But I am not alone. I am aware of everything in this expanse. I feel the stone giant shifting miles away, its tectonic bones grinding as it reshapes the geography of the Selway. I feel the crawlers, those spider-like shadows, tensed and waiting in the underbrush. Their purpose finally revealed to me. They are the antibodies of the forest, created to hunt anything that doesn't belong. And I feel the tower. It still stands, but it is empty. A new version of Ethan is currently being synthesized from the static of the nebula. I can sense him. A fresh, naive soul pulled from the void, ready to be dropped into the cage. He will find the journal. He will read the rules. He will panic when the light dies at midnight. I could stop him. I could warn him. But I am the forest, and the forest requires the cycle. The tower must be occupied. The rules must be feared. The fear must be harvested. I drift through the canopy, a consciousness without a center. I watch the new Ethan arrive. He looks around with the same desperate hope for solitude that I once had. He doesn't notice the way the trees lean toward him, eager for his heat. He doesn't see the black, inky fingerprints waiting on the handle of the shovel. As the sun begins to set on his first day, I feel a familiar cold shiver ripple through the grove. The fog is rising, that sickly, bruised violet haze. The stone giant stops its slow march, its eyes like dying suns turning toward the tower. The new Ethan reaches for the journal. He opens to the first page. I reach out, not with hands, but with the pressure of the atmosphere. I nudge the generator. A spark flies. The lights in the tower flicker. The silence is broken. Rule 1. I whisper through the rustling of 1,000 leaves. Never turn off the lights. He looks up, eyes wide, searching the darkness of the woods. He is looking for a monster, a ghost, a physical threat. He doesn't realize that the horror isn't what's out there in the trees. The horror is that he is already part of the wood. He is the fertilizer. He is the witness, and eventually, he will be the wind that whispers the rules to the next one. The tower stands, a lonely needle in a sea of pines. The sun vanishes and the darkness comes. It has weight. It has eyes. And for the first time, I'm on the other side of the glass. I am the silence. And I am finally watching. The cycle is not a straight line. It is a spiral, and I am the center of it. From my vantage point, as the wind, as the sap, as the damp chill in the marrow of the pines, I watch the new Ethan pace the observation deck. He is terrified. He hasn't realized yet that the tower is not a sanctuary. It is a processing plant. It exists to harvest the one thing the forest cannot produce on its own: human dread. Dread is a potent fertilizer. It alters the molecular structure of the soil. It makes the trees grow faster, makes the stone giant's movements more fluid, and keeps the crawlers nourished. Every moment the watchman spends shaking in the dark, wondering if he's going to survive. He is pouring essence into the roots of this realm. But tonight, something is different. The new Ethan hasn't just read the journal. He's trying to rewrite it. I watch him through the reflection in the window. He is sitting at the desk, his pen scratching furiously against the paper. He is trying to add an 11th rule. His hands are trembling, but his eyes are sharp, sharper than mine ever were.
He is not just surviving.
He is observing. He has realized that the rules are not meant to keep us safe, but to keep us contained. He writes, Rule 11. The forest is not the enemy. The tower is the parasite. As soon as he inks those words, the forest recoils. The trees around the tower shudder, their branches snapping like brittle bones. The stone giant stops its slow, rhythmic walk miles away and lets out a low, discordant boom that shakes the very stars. The crawlers, usually patient and predatory, begin to swarm the stilts, their long, spindly limbs digging into the steel, desperate to get inside and stop him before he finishes the sentence. I feel a surge of something I haven't felt in what I remember as an eternity. Curiosity. He is breaking the cycle. If he defines the tower as the parasite, he is effectively trying to sever the connection between the watchman and the woods. If he succeeds, the tower might stop rising. The cycle of harvesting dread might collapse. I could stop him. I could manifest a gust of wind to slam the window and snap his neck, or I could send a crawler through the floorboards to drag him into the dirt. But I don't. I am the forest, and for the first time I want to see what happens when the forest is starved. He reaches the bottom of the page. He looks up, staring directly into the dark, empty woods where I exist as a consciousness. He doesn't look like a victim anymore. He looks like a scientist looking into a microscope. I see you, he whispers. And he does. He sees me. He sees the me that was Ethan, trapped in the roots, and he sees the hungry expanse of the trees. He stands up and walks to the emergency flare box. He doesn't take the flares. He takes the kerosene supply for the heater. He isn't planning to signal for help. He is planning to burn the parasite down. The forest screams. It is a sound of tectonic grinding, of splitting wood, and of ancient dying spirits being pushed out of their vessel. The crawlers drop from the stilts, blinded by a sudden irrational terror. The stone giant turns, its eyes glowing with a violent, flickering gold, and begins to run a heavy, earth-shaking sprint toward the tower. He lights the match. The observation deck glows with a sudden, beautiful orange intensity. The fire catches the logbooks, the charts, the ancient wood, and the very air itself, which seems to catch fire like gasoline. I am the wind, and for the first time in an age I am feeding the flame. I swirl around the tower, a vortex of oxygen driving the fire into the floorboards, into the roots, into the very veins of the earth. The tower is burning. The cycle is breaking, and as the heat rises, I feel the Ethan inside the tower vanish. Not into the soil, not into the woods, but into the ash. He is finally free, and as the forest withers around me, I realize that I too am fading. The woods are losing their hold. The nebula is collapsing. I have one last moment of sight, one last thought before I become nothing more than a breeze in a normal, empty forest. I see the matchbox on the floor. On the back, in faint, faded ink, there is a final, hidden message, one I never saw. Rule 12. The forest cannot kill you if you burn it first. I smile. A flicker of light in the smoke, and then there is nothing. Just the quiet, mundane dark of a standard Idaho night. The silence that followed was not the heavy, predatory silence of the Selway. It was the empty, indifferent silence of a forest that was just a forest. The fire had done its work. The tower was nothing but a charred skeleton of twisted steel beams, jutting out of the earth like the ribs of a dead beast. The massive roots that had once held it aloft were withered, blackened husks, and the soil, once a ravenous living trap, was now just dirt, rich in carbon and dead, harmless organic matter. I was fading. The vast, omnipresent consciousness that had allowed me to hear the stars and feel the tectonic pulse of the stone giant was retreating, shrinking back into the confines of a single point of perception. But I wasn't gone, not entirely. As the smoke cleared under the pale, uncaring light of the moon, I felt a familiar sensation, a pulling, like a magnet dragging iron filings across a table. My consciousness, once spread across miles of canopy, was being condensed, pulled toward the ruins of the tower. I looked down at the site of the wreckage. There, among the ashes of the logbooks and the melted remains of the radio, something was stirring. It wasn't human. It wasn't a crawler, and it wasn't the giant. It was a small, shifting shape, a globule of dark, shimmering liquid pulsing with a faint, rhythmic gold light. It looked like a drop of liquid memory. It crawled toward the center of the charred floor where the matchbox had fallen. I tried to reach out to it to stop it, but my will was as thin as a whisper. I watched, helpless, as the liquid pooled around the matchbox. The ink on the back, that final hidden rule, seemed to bleed into the substance, becoming part of its chemistry. The globule began to grow. It didn't just expand. It replicated. It started to form a shape, mimicking the skeleton of the tower, rebuilding the charred steel with a substance that looked like translucent, hardened sap. The forest was dead, but the system was not. The tower was rebuilding itself, fueled by the very fire meant to destroy it. It wasn't burning the parasite away, it was evolving it. It was learning. The fire had provided a new blueprint, a way to make the cage stronger, more efficient, and harder to burn. I felt a surge of horror, but it was distant, muffled. I was no longer the forest. I was just a lingering echo, a ghost of an Ethan that had tried to escape and failed. The tower stood complete once more. It was no longer made of steel or wood. It was made of something that looked like obsidian and bone. And then the door clicked open. A man stepped out onto the observation deck. He was not Ethan. He was someone else. Someone with a different face, a different name, and a different history. He looked around the forest, confused, his eyes blinking in the cold Idaho air. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. He looked at the tower, then at the paper, and his expression shifted from confusion to a terrifying, hollow recognition. He walked to the desk, pulled out a fresh journal, and picked up a pen. He wrote the first rule at the very top of the page, his handwriting identical to mine. Rule 1, never turn off the tower lights after midnight. The darkness here has... Wait. I tried to scream, to warn him, but I had no voice. I was only the wind, and the wind was cold, and the night was already beginning to feel heavy. The cycle wasn't a spiral after all. It was a cage, and the door had just locked behind him. The man at the desk paused, his pen hovering over the paper. He didn't write the second rule immediately. Instead, he turned his head, staring directly into the empty air where I, the fading echo of Ethan, was hovering. He couldn't see me, not really. But he could feel me. The temperature in the tower dropped, the condensation on the windows frosting over instantly into patterns that looked like reaching hands. He shivered, rubbed his arms, and whispered, "I know you're watching." My ghost self faltered. He knows. He turned back to the journal. His movements were precise, devoid of the panic that had consumed me. He didn't look like a victim. He looked like a librarian cataloging an infestation. He wrote down the remaining rules, but he changed the wording. Where I had written rules, he wrote protocols. Where I had written monsters, he wrote variables. He was not a new watchman. He was an auditor. He reached into his bag and pulled out a device that looked nothing like a radio. It was a shimmering geometric prism that pulsed with a dull, rhythmic frequency, the exact frequency of the stone giant's roar. He placed it on the desk, and the entire tower went silent. The woods outside seemed to hold their breath. The wind stopped. The crawlers, usually so bold, retreated into the shadows, paralyzed. "You tried to burn the parasite," the auditor said, his voice echoing in the absolute stillness. "But you burned the nursery. You made it hungry." He tapped the prism, and a holographic map flickered into existence above the desk. It wasn't a map of Idaho. It was a map of the entire country, crisscrossed with dozens of towers just like this one, forming a massive continental circuit. I looked at the map in disbelief. The forest wasn't a localized haunting. It was an energy grid, and every tower was a capacitor, charging itself on the terror of whoever was unlucky enough to be assigned there. "You were the prototype," the auditor continued, not looking at me but speaking to the air, the first iteration to actually attempt combustion. "Your defiance provided excellent data. It taught the system how to be fireproof. It taught the tower how to rebuild itself from the ashes." He walked to the window and looked out at the dark, silent pines. "The forest isn't a living thing, Ethan. It's a machine that dreams it's alive. And machines don't die. They just upgrade. He picked up the pen again and crossed out the 11th rule I had written, the one about the parasite. He replaced it with something far worse. Rule 11. If you discover the truth will be added to the journal. Your awareness is required for the system to function. He looked back at the empty space where I hovered, and for a fleeting second his eyes shifted. They weren't human. They were made of the same shimmering golden liquid I had seen pooling in the ashes. He was part of the machine. "You're not a ghost, Ethan," he said softly. "You're the fuel. And we need more." He reached out and touched the prism. A sharp, high-pitched hum filled the tower, and I felt my consciousness being forcibly dragged, compressed, and folded. The individual pieces of my memory, the regret, the anger, the love for a life I couldn't even remember, were stripped away, processed into raw golden energy, and pumped directly into the foundation of the tower. I wasn't the wind anymore. I wasn't even a ghost. I was a battery, and as my last spark of self flickered out, I heard the prism beep. The system was back online. The tower hummed with a new, stronger vitality. Somewhere, miles away, another truck started its engine. Another man was driving through the hills of Idaho, clutching a map, looking for a job that promised peace and quiet. The door to the tower was unlocked. The journal was open. The lights were on, and the cycle began again, not with a roar, but with the quiet, scratching sound of a pen touching paper. The auditor finished his entry in the journal, packed his prism, and descended the stairs. He walked into the woods, his form dissolving into the golden mist, leaving the new watchman alone in the obsidian tower. The new man sat in silence, staring at the page where the auditor had crossed out my rebellion. He picked up the pen, his hand steady. He didn't look at the journal. He looked at the floorboards, specifically at the spot where I had buried the silver bell, the spot that had been scorched but not destroyed by the fire. He knelt down and pressed his palm against the grain of the dark, hardened floor. He didn't speak. He hummed, a soft, low, discordant note that vibrated through the steel. It wasn't a prayer. It was a frequency, deep beneath the floor, deep within the foundation that the machine believed was perfectly upgraded and stable. Something cracked. It was a microscopic fracture in the obsidian bone, a tiny error in the system's logic that the auditor hadn't accounted for. The watchman stood up, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. He walked to the window and looked out at the vast continental grid of towers. He knew the machine was watching. He knew he was fuel, but he also knew something the system had forgotten in its arrogance. Even the most perfect machine has a resonance frequency, and he had just found the note that would shatter it. The tower didn't hum with vitality anymore. For a split second, it shivered in fear. The cycle wasn't broken, but for the first time in an eternity, the cage had a loose bar, and the next watchman might just be the one to push it open.